who I am, like where I've been or what I used to be, is not important. Enough to know I've never been anywhere and returned empty-handed. I've made calls, and those calls have been returned, if you know what I mean. I have files people would die for. Maybe some have already. I'm a devotee of dishonorable data. I detect disgrace. I log lies. I bank bad behavior. And I scrutinize scandal. Then and now.
Leo Frank was the last person to see Mary Fagan alive. The city went absolutely wild over the murder of this 13-year-old girl.
It's a macabre, fascinating case that had elements of race and sex and class. Out of it grew these polar opposite organizations that are with us still in this century.
The Leo Frank case is a case about anti-Semitism. It's a case about a hatred between North and South. It's a case about a terrible, terrible injustice.
On March 3rd, 1991, Rodney King, an African-American, was mercilessly beaten by a couple of Los Angeles police officers, while others stood by and watched. Even though the video evidence illustrated the brutal assault, the officers were acquitted. Rodney King was not the first citizen the system failed to protect. On the morning of August 17, 1915, state guards stood by as 25 men entered the Milledgeville prison near Atlanta, Georgia. The group had lynching on their mind. The object of their anger was a mild-mannered 31-year-old New York Jew.
The Leo Frank case was a culmination of a great legal and societal upheaval that had begun 2 years previously when a young girl was found dead in the factory where Frank was the superintendent. There's a great deal of debate about the guilt or innocence of all the parties, and the Leo Frank case at first is a murder mystery.
About 3 o'clock in the morning, on Sunday, April 27, 1913, Newt Lee, a night watchman, went down to the basement of the National Pencil Factory to use the toilet. He looked up and saw a body lying on the floor. It was Mary Fagan, a 13-year-old factory worker. Newt Lee ran upstairs and immediately tried to call Leo Frank, his boss. No answer. He phoned the police. They came and examined the body. It was terribly beat up. She was cut above the left ear. Both eyes were black and swollen.
At first, they didn't think she was a white girl. She had been in the basement and was buried in coal and basically was black until they wiped her face and discovered that she was white. And at that time in 1913, white Southern womanhood was to be protected. And, she wasn't.
They sent a car out to Frank's house, awakening him. When Frank came to greet the officers, he was a mess. He was frazzled, nervous, anxious. He seemed overly concerned to the police officers. Frank went with the police to the morgue where the little girl was laid out, and according to the police, Frank refused to look at the body, giving the police the sense of guilt on Frank's part.
The city of Atlanta woke up to screaming red headlines. Girl is assaulted and then murdered in the heart of town.
William Randolph Hearst had just bought a newspaper in Atlanta, the Atlanta Georgian, and he had staffed it with crack reporters from his New York and Chicago papers. These guys were sitting down in Atlanta, cooling their heels, bored out of their minds, wanting the kind of big-time crime story that they had played up in New York or Chicago, and suddenly, here was this little girl's body.
The Georgian began to saturate Atlanta with sensational stories of the murder. Its competitors, the Atlanta Journal and the Constitution, were forced to keep up. Rumors and exaggerations vied for headlines, making the murder the talk of the town.
Atlantans weren't naive, but they had just never seen a big-time front-page newspaper operation in full frenzy. And this was a frenzy of coverage. People were dreaming about the death of Mary Fagan.
And I think when people read about how she was really horribly murdered, it makes you think. And at some point, she was awake, and she knew what was going on and what was happening to her.
It seemed that all of Georgia came to see Mary Fagan's body. Over 10,000 came to pay their respects, the largest crowd ever to attend a viewing in Atlanta. At the funeral, emotions ran high. Mary Fagan's mother fainted. People prayed and cried. Others sang songs. The city of Atlanta was in mourning.
Mary Fagan became an emblem of the virginal Southern girl. You can almost look back and see her with her pigtails and her little dress and her mesh purse.
She was just coming into blossom, and she was playing Sleeping Beauty the next day in church and never got to play Sleeping Beauty.
The people of Atlanta and the newspapers were on the same page. They demanded action. They wanted an arrest. The pressure was on the cops to find Mary Fagan's killer. But there was a problem.
The crime scene at the National Pencil Factory was a disaster. The police let anyone and everyone into the building. So by mid-morning on the day the body was discovered, there was no way of telling what exactly had occurred. The opportunity to harvest what would, by today's standards, be good forensic evidence was blown by police incompetence. Discovered by the body were these two extraordinarily enigmatic notes that seemed to have been written by Mary Fagan in her death throes. At least that's how whoever composed these notes wanted them to read. One of them went to effect, "I went down here to make water, and a long, tall Negro pushed me down this hole. I write while he play with me." That long, tall Negro did this by himself. Obviously, they weren't written by Mary Fagan. They were part of some kind of cover-up, but whose cover-up?
A day after the murder, police searched the factory for clues. By the elevator shaft in the basement, they found a parasol belonging to Mary Fagan and a mound of human excrement. But the cops were only concerned with evidence found on the second floor of the factory, where Mary Fagan's boss, Leo Frank, had his office. There, at Mary Fagan's workstation, they found strands of hair twined around a lathe and some blood spots on the floor nearby. Leo Frank was now the main suspect, and the cops leaked their suspicions to the press.
During the next few weeks after the murder, all kinds of rumors about Frank crop up. He was a pervert. He was a sodomist. He was some kind of freak. Whatever was in the streets was in the newspapers.
There were caricatures of him that made him look like the devil, and he didn't have a particularly big nose, but the nose grew and grew and grew in these caricatures.
In addition, as people in the South said, if I was innocent, I'd shout it out from the rooftops. I'd tell everybody. Frank did not speak to reporters. Frank did not do interviews. Frank did not make statements because his lawyers advised against it. The people who didn't know Frank just saw a guy whose eyes were popping out and being ice cold.
Leo Frank was born in Texas and grew up in Brooklyn. He was a brainy kid, liked to read, went to Cornell, graduated in 1906 as a mechanical engineer. His future looked promising when his uncle Moses invited Leo to run his pencil factory in Atlanta. In 1910, in an arranged marriage, he was wed to Lucille Selig, who came from a wealthy Jewish family.
She was first attracted to him because she wanted to make him blush. She wanted to say things that would bring the life out in him. He believed in facts and figures. He believed in data. He was also, though, a shy, insecure, and anxiety-ridden young man.
Now, the other problems with Frank are, Frank was an outsider. Frank was a Northerner. In addition, Frank represented Northern industry. He was a factory manager. The South struggled going from rural agriculture into industrialism. And you have to understand Southern psychology. They were terribly afraid that their women and their daughters would go into these factories and be taken advantage of.
When one of their own was sacrificed, as they would have seen it, on the altar of industry and commerce, it seemed as if it was, a continuation of the rape of the South that had occurred during the war and especially during Reconstruction.
It didn't take long for Hugh Dorsey, the Solicitor General of Georgia, to see the political potential of the Fagan case. If he could convict Leo Frank, a Jew from the North, he would become a Southern hero, and there would be no office in the state beyond his reach. So, working closely with the police, Dorsey began to build a case against Frank.
He had lost several high-profile cases prior to the Frank trial. Hence, everything was on the line for him.
On the other hand, a victory would erase all memories of failure. There was political necessity to find a culprit because the public demands satisfaction and gratification.
At the same time, the police department had an agenda of their own.
There had been numerous scandals that had plagued the police department. They were not above manufacturing evidence. They were not above coercing affidavits. They were a brutalizing force. And they were also in a somewhat desperate position in that there had been a great many unsolved crimes in Atlanta prior to the Fagan murder, and they had to find a killer.
On the 29th of April, 1913, police arrived at Frank's office and put him in cuffs. Unfortunately for Dorsey, right after the arrest, evidence was discovered that put a whole new spin on the case. While Leo Frank was sitting in jail awaiting trial, Jim Conley, a 27-year-old janitor at the National Pencil Factory, was identified as the man who wrote the notes found beside Mary Fagan's body. He was also seen trying to wash blood off his shirt. But Prosecutor Dorsey was not about to change his course.
It would not have been sufficient if Mary Fagan's death had been paid for by the death of this black janitor. But to pay for it with the life of a Jew, that would be sufficient.
Instead of treating Conley as a suspect, police interrogators tried to get a sworn statement from him that would link Leo Frank to the murder. They interrogated him for several days.
Jim Conley gave 4 conflicting affidavits during the police investigation. In his initial affidavit, he said he was not even at the factory on the day of the crime. In his second affidavit, he said that Frank dictated the murder notes to him the day before the crime. The police said the crime had no markings of premeditation. It was a crime of passion. In his final affidavit, he told of helping Frank transport the body.
I think Conley was telling the truth. There are contradictions in the details, but the thrust of his story makes sense. Affidavits don't mean much. They don't rise to the same level of credibility of testimony under oath, subject to cross-examination.
In a court today, no prosecutor would go to court on 4 modified affidavits attesting to the good character and honesty of the witness.
The trial of Leo Frank began on July 28, 1913, and it was conducted in a small temporary courtroom. The room was tiny, hot, filled to capacity. The windows were thrown open, so it felt as if all of Atlanta, the eyes of all of Atlanta, weighed palpably upon those within the courtroom. And it was a close, intimate, explosive environment for a trial.
The scene outside the courthouse was chaotic. People lined up for hours to get in. Hundreds were refused entry and remained outside. Fiddlin' John Carson entertained the crowd by singing the Ballad of Mary Fagan, which contained lyrics that fingered Frank as the murderer.
Little Mary Fagan, she went to town one day. She went to the pencil factory to get a little pay.
Outside the courtroom, there were people that were crowded in around the courthouse building. They were on roofs across the streets from the courthouse. There was shouts of death to the Jew, death threats in general against anyone who was offering support to Frank.
You'll go home no more. He sneaked along behind her till she reached the metal room. He laughed and said, "Little Mary, you've met your fatal doom."
The jury in the Leo Frank case, though sequestered, they had to walk back and forth from the hotel each day and heard what people were saying in the streets. I think they were certainly affected by the sentiment against Leo Frank.
As the crowd continued to build outside the courthouse, the hysteria quickly seeped inside.
Judge Leonard Roan, the presiding judge in the trial of Leo Frank, was a respected member of the bar, but he was ineffectual, weak, and would die within a year and a half of cancer. As a consequence, the trial got out of control. He was unable to exert the sort of influence that he should have.
There were sworn statements that jurors, prior to their selection, had told people in their town, if I get on the jury, I'll hang the Jew.
A mob trial is one in which the psychology of the outside, the psychology of the people outside the courtroom, makes it almost impossible for the jurors to deliberate fairly. If there were ever the word mob trial in the dictionary, the picture on top of it would be the Leo Frank case.
But even the mob went silent when Jim Conley, the prosecution's star witness, took the stand. Conley testified that on Confederate Memorial Day of 1913, Mary Fagan came to the factory. She arrived shortly before 12, went to Frank's office and got her pay. According to Conley, Frank lured Mary Fagan to her second-floor workstation, attacked her, attempted to rape her. When she resisted, he hit her across the face. Her head hit a metal lathe, knocking her unconscious. Leo Frank then strangled her to death. When Conley arrived on the second floor, he saw Mary Fagan's dead body. Together, they carried her into the elevator and took her to the basement. Frank then said to Conley, "Here's the best way to get out of this. I'll dictate you these notes, and you put them by the body."
Jim Conley was a mesmerizing, articulate storyteller of a witness who dazzled a courtroom of skeptical viewers and listeners. The defense tried to beat the case on its merits. They tried to say, the story that Conley is telling is cockamamie. It doesn't add up. There wasn't enough time for it to have occurred as he said.
The defense alleged that Mary Fagan came in at noon on Confederate Memorial Day to collect her back pay of $1.20. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Frank was already home eating with his wife and mother-in-law. There simply wasn't time for Frank to attack Mary Fagan, strangle her, get Conley to drag her to the elevator, take her to the basement, dictate the notes found beside her body, and make it home to eat lunch, all in a 90-minute period.
There were very few minutes between the time Mary Fagan arrived to get her pay and the time Leo Frank left that afternoon to go home for lunch. The defense hammered this home, showing the improbability of the state's timeline.
To convict Frank, Prosecutor Dorsey needed to firmly establish that Frank had it in him to commit such a heinous crime. Once again, Conley came through for Dorsey by giving testimony that would inflame the jury.
He testified that during the months prior to Mary Fagan's murder, he had often served as a lookout for Frank. He had stood guard in the lobby of the pencil factory building in downtown Atlanta so that Frank could, as Conley would have put it, chat up young girls. And Jim further said that, "I've seen him in a position I've never seen another man. He was down on his knees with a young lady and she had her skirt pulled up to here." He was describing oral sex in the courtroom.
The judge immediately banished all women spectators. They protested, but were forced to leave. In 1913, in Georgia, oral sex was considered perversion. Conley's allegations were very damaging.
As soon as Jim Conley began talking about Leo Frank's preference for oral sex, the defense should have objected and asked that that testimony be stricken from the record. Instead, the defense allowed Conley to tell the entire tale in direct examination, believing in all of its arrogance that they could defeat Conley in cross-examination and show him to be a liar.
And the assumption was that two smart lawyers could certainly get the truth out of, quote, any dumb nigger, unquote. They grilled Conley for 15 hours. He never changed his story.
Only after failing to successfully cross-examine Conley did the defense ask the judge to strike the testimony. At that point, the judge had no choice but to allow the testimony to stand. The courtroom erupted with applause. In one of his rare attempts to control the crowd, Judge Rowan threw the people responsible out of the courtroom.
The defense was then forced to do something which no defense lawyer ever wants to do. They made character the basis of their defense of Leo Frank. However, that leads inevitably to the prosecution being able to counter with witnesses attesting to the defendant's poor character, and the prosecution did this in spades in the Frank trial.
Now, there were always rumors that factory managers abused their positions, looked into the girls' dressing rooms, may have gone further than looking. These are all rumors. Maybe they were true. Maybe they were not true. Maybe Frank did do things like this.
The family believes very strongly that Leo Frank had made previous advances before her murder, that Mary had come home and said some things to the family that had caused them to be of concern. Basically, the family thought that he was very malicious and very cruel and a sexual pervert.
As various witnesses took the stand, no one could have guessed that there was one eyewitness who had yet to come forward. The longest trial in the history of Georgia was about to end. In their summation, the defense dismissed the hair and the blood found on the second floor as a result of common factory mishaps. Then they brought forth their version of the events. They claimed that Mary Fagan had got her pay from Frank and was still alive when she left the second floor. When she got to the first floor, Jim Conley grabbed her, and in a struggle he hit her, knocking her unconscious. He stole her money, picked her up, and pushed her down a scuttle hole to the basement. Conley then strangled Mary Fagan to silence her. The theory seemed plausible, but would the jury buy it?
The defense believed that a jury would never accept a black man's word over a white's in a capital case. The defense thought it was going to win.
Dorsey gives a wonderful summation, and he said, "This man is guilty." And the church bells outside rang. Guilty! And the church bells outside of the court rang. Guilty! And the church bells rang again. It was extremely dramatic.
The mood outside the courtroom was intense and hostile. The police could not control the crowd in the streets. But despite the setbacks, Leo Frank's outlook was positive.
It amazed me how hopeful Leo always was. It was no self-pity. It was more, This is the way my life is going. It's not great, I know that, but I'm getting so much encouragement from so many people from across the country that I really believe in the end I will be set free.
When the verdict was returned, the judge had the defense counsel and Leo Frank out of the courtroom for the reading of the verdict for fear that were Frank acquitted, that they would all be lynched.
The atmosphere was so highly charged that the lawyers came that day with pistols. And they were armed to protect themselves in case they were set upon by the mob.
Frank awaited the verdict in his cell. His wife, Lucille, was at his side. The jury took less than 4 hours. The verdict was guilty as charged. David Marks, a friend of the family, brought Leo the news. He received it with characteristic coolness. Lucille fainted.
I don't think there's anything the defense could have done that would have resulted in an acquittal in this case. The case was too political, too ethnically divisive, too emotional. You can criticize the defense for not getting changes of venue. You can criticize the defense for tactics. That's rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
If a court trial is theater, which I believe it is, and the victor is whoever puts on the best show, the prosecution put on the best show, and Conley was the star. The case was about this mesmerizing figure of Jim Conley. He had sold the jurors his version of events.
It was impossible for jurors to deliberate fairly in that case. That doesn't suggest that the jurors would have come to a different verdict without the mob. Many of the jurors had internalized the mob. They were the mob.
When the jury provided Judge Leonard Roan with their decision of guilty, the jury was met by the jubilation of the crowd outside of the courthouse. Hugh Dorsey was hoisted upon the shoulders of several men and carried about in the streets. Mary Fagan's stepfather shook the hand of a number of the jurors. In fact, many of them became local celebrities, as it were.
This case was fixed. I think everybody knew he was innocent. It's very hard for me to believe that any judge presiding over this case or any prosecutor could have had any real doubts about who the real culprit was.
Jury finds Frank guilty. The judge says, even though I don't know if he was guilty or not, I'm sentencing him to hang.
I think Roan genuinely believed Frank was innocent and was disturbed by what had happened in that courtroom.
I think the people that speak up believe he's innocent. I think there's a silent majority, especially here in Marietta, that believe he is very, very, very guilty.
All 3 Atlanta newspapers argued that Frank should receive a new trial. For some Southerners, this seeming reversal by the papers was evidence of Jewish influence.
The case had become a tremendous cause célèbre, and people from all over the country were writing letters, signing petitions. It was a tremendous hue and cry to save Leo Frank's life.
The more people outside of Georgia protested, the more stubborn Georgians became, saying, why are they saying this? These people have never been in Georgia. They are being purchased by Frank's rich Jewish friends.
The anti-Frank campaign was led by Southern populist Tom Watson, publisher of the Jeffersonian, a weekly newspaper. He was an ambitious politician with his eyes on the Senate. To his supporters, he was a paragon of virtue.
He was very moral in his own life, and nothing could be more offensive to him than the idea of a young girl employee being raped and murdered by her employer in her place of employment. He didn't approve of child labor. He didn't approve of women working in factories. He was doubly offended by Mary Fagan's demise.
Tom Watson, he was an opportunist. However, in the Leo Frank case, he indulged in the worst sort of anti-Semitic behavior, whipping up the populace of Georgia and the South into a frenzy of anti-Jewish feeling, simply because it was convenient for him and served his purposes.
I mean, he was the one that called him, the Jewish libertine sodomite and the pervert and this stuff. it worked very well in increasing the sale of his paper.
Watson added fuel to the anti-Frank fires. Each passing day brought Leo closer to the gallows, but the one person who could keep him from hanging was still not ready to come forward. During the 2-year appeal process, Leo Frank sat in his cell, convinced justice would prevail. In uncharacteristic fashion, he wrote tender love letters to his wife, Lucille, who was tireless on his behalf. "My darling, your presence was a tonic and inspiration. Don't worry, we will beat this thing yet. With much love, your sweetheart."
I believe he fell in love with his wife after he was in jail because she stood by him. Lucille Frank was a remarkable woman. She was only 22 or 23 years old when her husband Leo was arrested for this crime. She developed an inner strength that came out during this, and Lucille wrote letters all over the country, "Help my husband, help my husband."
Numerous appeals were filed on behalf of Leo Frank, raising over 100 points of law.
During the course of Leo Frank's appeals, legislatures in several states passed resolutions urging the state of Georgia to commute his sentence.
An appeal only looks at the written record of the case. Very hard to reverse a conviction on appeal. For the most part, less than 5% of convictions are reversed. And in those days, it may have been even lower. You have to find a specific error that a judge made. Appeals, tragically, are not about justice. They're about legal errors. They're very, very technical.
So you now have 5 Supreme Court decisions, 3 from Georgia, 2 from the United States Supreme Court, all of which say, for technical reasons, we cannot grant a new trial.
One man had it in his power to save Frank: John Slaton, governor of Georgia. A former lawyer with a sterling reputation, he and the prison commission were bombarded with over 100,000 letters requesting that Frank's sentence be commuted. Even Judge Rowan, on his deathbed, wrote a letter on Frank's behalf.
The verdict tortured Rowan. He wrote a letter asking for clemency for Frank, and it was used at the clemency proceeding.
The governor was the most popular politician in the state, John Slaton. His term was ending in a couple of weeks. He could easily have postponed the decision and left it to his successor, Nathaniel Harris. Slaton knew that his successor was in Dorsey's camp and would have let the hanging take place. Slaton, being an honest, moral individual, thoroughly reviewed the case. He reviewed the evidence. He went to the pencil factory.
Strangely, it was an overlooked piece of evidence that convinced Governor Slaton of Frank's innocence.
At Leo Frank's trial, Jim Conley testified that he defecated in the elevator shaft on the day of the crime. If Jim Conley had used the elevator to take the girl's body to the basement, that mound of feces would have been mashed the day of the crime. Instead, the day after the crime, it was still fresh. What this piece of evidence tells us is that Jim Conley was lying about using the elevator to take Mary Fagan's body to the basement. It was the beginning of Governor Slaton's understanding of the many lies that Jim Conley had told.
Governor Slaton told his wife that he was commuting the sentence to life imprisonment, and it might mean his life by announcing it. And his wife said, "I would rather be the widow of a brave man than the wife of a coward."
Slaton now decided to take Frank off death row. Before announcing his decision, for Frank's own protection, Slaton moved him to an isolated prison farm in Milledgeville, Georgia, 175 miles east of Atlanta. 3 days before his tenure as governor was over, Slaton commuted Frank's sentence from death to life imprisonment.
He was afraid of being mobbed and hurt after he signed the commutation order, and that's why he skipped the state and didn't come back for 2 years. And I think John Slaton, the governor, is a profile in venality rather than a profile in courage.
It was a political death penalty that he inflicted upon himself. I mean, he was nearly mobbed in his home. It was the most unpopular position any politician could take.
Tom Watson's editorials inspired a newly formed organization that called itself the Knights of Mary Fagan. The Knights breathed new life into a dying Ku Klux Klan. Their first activity involved a carefully planned boycott of Jewish businesses.
People in Atlanta passed out cards, leaflets, brochures, flyers. Jews, you better watch out. Jews, you better get out of town. Jews, you never know who's going to be next. Jews, we don't want you here. The Frank case stimulated the expression of incredible anti-Semitism in the South.
In response, another organization was catapulted onto the political scene, the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. Its mandate? To combat bigotry and unmask those responsible for hate-related activities.
It was a realization for many Jews in America that what was going on in Eastern Europe could also happen to them in the United States. That the racism, the bigotry, the anti-Semitism that was endemic in Eastern Europe was also pretty widespread in many parts of the South.
A month after the commutation, fellow prisoner William Crean sneaked up on Frank in the middle of the night and slashed his throat. Frank almost bled to death. Fortunately, his cellmate, who was a physician, immediately stopped the bleeding and closed the wound. It was now clear that Frank would not survive long in jail, but there was still one person who could both save and exonerate him. To Atlantans, it seemed that the North got to a Southern governor and bent the justice system to let a Northerner, worse, a Jew, get away with murder. Men of Georgia were going to do something about it. The honor of Southern women had to be defended.
According to the newspapers, some of the, quote, best men, unquote, in Marietta concocted a plan to kidnap Frank, bring him back to Marietta, and kill him.
It was not a mob, it was not a lynch mob, it was a paramilitary group, if you will, well organized, tightly controlled.
The Knights of Mary Fagan had over 100 members. 25 men were chosen. In the dead of night, they drove to Milledgeville and easily passed through the prison gates.
Clearly, it was an inside job. There was some cooperation from inside. This was a state act. This was an institutional act of the government.
They stormed the prison. They went to Frank's room in the infirmary. They told Frank, "Get out of bed, you're coming with us." Frank said, "Let me put my pants on." They said, "No, you don't have to do that for where you're going."
They dragged Frank outside to one of the waiting cars and drove for 6 hours to the town of Marietta.
It's a horrible thought, sitting in that car in your nightshirt and barefooted. I'm sure he knew pretty much what was going to happen to him. He was not a stupid man. But if you put yourself in that position, it's horrifying.
I can't believe people would actually feel that they can take the law into their own hands and lynch another human being. I mean, it's just too appalling to me. I just can't even imagine that anyone could, for any reason, justify that type of behavior in their mind. It's sick.
Lynching was regarded as the last act of chivalry. It was the way a patriarchal society protected its women. Most lynchings resulted from sexual crimes, and there was a strong disposition in the culture to support lynching. If you look at lynching photographs, they constitute a kind of pornography. The people gathered in a crowd around a lynched body have a strange, otherworldly gaze on their face that is somewhat erotic and perverse, and I am certain it's because on a subliminal level, the lynching has excited them. Forward thinkers at the time believed that once women gained the right to vote and once women were unshackled from their men, that lynchings would end, and they did.
They put Frank on a table, put the noose around his neck, asked Frank if he had anything to say. Frank said, "Would you please give this ring to my wife?" And he took off his wedding ring.
No Fagan was involved in the lynching of Leo Frank. That's very important to me. Those persons that were part of the lynching, and they were to keep the truth and never to divulge who they were. But I want to repeat that no Fagan was involved in the lynching of Leo Frank.
I think Frank was guilty and got his just desert. Anything other than execution would have been a miscarriage of justice.
And the men left before Frank was dead. They left him swaying in the wind. Word, however, of the lynching reached people in town, and it was like 15 or 20 minutes later that people from Marietta started coming out. And they took souvenirs. They took snippets of the rope. They patted the tree. They were jubilant. They wanted to commemorate the oak tree because this is where they felt the murder of Mary Fagan had been vindicated.
When justice fails through the normal procedures of the law, strong action can be justified.
The lynchers didn't need lawyers. They didn't need defenders. They were the heroes. They were the leading members of the clergy, a layman.
There were postcards that emerged from that scene of the lynching itself, and the middle-aged men are crowded in around the body, almost as if we want to be part of this. And those postcards were sold throughout the South for years after 1915, well into the 1930s.
The hanging of a Jew in the state of Georgia took place at a time when Jews in Russia were being massacred by rampaging mobs. Because this type of thing was not supposed to happen in America, a blanket of silence fell upon the Frank case.
The people who lived through this were traumatized by it. That is, the Jews were, and didn't want us to raise the issue again, didn't want us to apply for a pardon because that would bring all the old prejudices back up to the surface.
But the silence surrounding this case was finally broken in 1982 when Alonzo Mann, who had been an office boy for Leo Frank, finally revealed what he saw the day Mary Fagan was murdered.
So I walked over to the steps, and when I turned my head to the right, Jim Conley was standing there with a girl in his arms, and the girl was limp. Jim Conley turned around to me and says, "If you say anything about this, I will kill you."
After being threatened by Conley, Alonzo ran to his mother and told her what had happened. She told him to keep his mouth shut, and he did, for almost 70 years.
Why didn't he say anything during the trial? Conley was locked up. Conley could not possibly be a threat to man. Huge rewards were being offered of any evidence that could point to Frank's innocence. It's just no way that he would not have come forward at that time.
I think his parents gave him very bad advice. They were probably afraid for him. They didn't want anything to happen to their child. They were being protective. I mean, I wish he had come forward sooner. I wish he had testified at the trial, but he didn't, and you can't go back, and there's nothing you can really do about it at this point. It's just too bad.
2 years prior to his death, Alonzo submitted to a lie detector test and passed with flying colors. Nonetheless, the state of Georgia refused to exonerate Frank. grudgingly granting him a posthumous pardon on the grounds that the state had failed to protect him.
The man was innocent. He was framed. He was lynched. The verdict of history has condemned the state of Georgia. The verdict of history has condemned the lynchers. Leo Frank is remembered as a martyr to injustice.
After Frank's conviction, Jim Conley served 1 year as an accessory to the crime. The Knights of Mary Fagan delivered to Lucille her husband's wedding ring. Despite the intimidation, she continued to live in Atlanta and always signed her name, Mrs. Leo M. Frank.